ibn Utbah, he says, I went to Aisha and I said, can you describe the moments when the Prophet ﷺ became most severely ill? She said that the Prophet ﷺ became so ill that it got to a point where he was in and out of consciousness. And we know the fever of the Prophet ﷺ was so severe that when you touched his body, it would burn you. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said that I touched the Prophet ﷺ's body and I thought, how can a human being have this high of a fever? And the Prophet ﷺ said that I am tested twice as much as everyone else. Why? ذَاكَ لِأَنَّ لِي أَجْرًا, because I have double the reward. Double the trial, double the reward. So the fever of the Prophet ﷺ was more severe than anything that any of the companions had ever felt. So she said that the Prophet ﷺ became severely ill and he would go in and out of consciousness, and then he'd wake up and he'd say, أَصَلَّ النَّاسِ, have the people prayed yet? And we'd say to the Prophet ﷺ, not yet. So Rasulullah ﷺ would say, can you put some water in a bucket for me so that I can wash up, do wudu for salah? So she said that I do so, and the Prophet ﷺ would start, but he couldn't finish. He would lose consciousness again, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he'd wake up, and every time he woke up, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what was he asking? Asalla nas, did the people pray yet? And the same thing, the Prophet ﷺ would say, can you give me the water? And he would try to bathe, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wash himself until he had enough energy to go to the salah. And he keeps on asking, Asalla nas, Asalla nas, Asalla nas. And eventually, the Prophet ﷺ asks, have the people prayed? And we say no, and Rasulullah ﷺ was able to do enough of wudu that the Prophet ﷺ then says, tell Abu Bakr to lead the salah. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu leads the salah from Salatul Isha, Fajr, and then the next day at Dhuhr, the Prophet ﷺ called for Al-Abbas and Ali, may Allah be pleased with them, to come and carry the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they carried him to the salah with his feet dragging on the ground, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was leading the salah already, and Abu Bakr was going to move back to let the Prophet ﷺ take his place, and Rasulullah ﷺ told him to stay, and instead they set up a chair next to Abu Bakr, and the Prophet ﷺ prayed next to him, sitting, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is the Prophet ﷺ making every last attempt, as Aisha radiallahu anha narrates, to go out and to be with the people and to join the salah, even as he sallallahu alaihi wasallam cannot even walk at that point. And she said that as he got sicker, she said, ما أغبط أحدا بهون موت بعد الذي رأيت من شدة موت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. She said, I don't envy anyone over their death after I see the death of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, the way his death was. And look at her, radiyallahu ta'ala anha. You know, they used to ask her, how do you know so much about medicine? She said, because she's asking every doctor, she's listening in, she's trying to cure the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam by any means necessary. And one of the most beautiful ahadith, subhanallah, in al-Bukhari, she says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to breathe in his hands, and he used to read the mu'awwidatan, قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ and قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ, and he used to wipe his hands over his body. And she said that the Prophet ﷺ got so sick that he couldn't do that anymore. So she said, فَلَمَّا ثَقُلَ كُنْتُ أَنْفِثُ عَلَيْهِ بِهِنَّ وَأَمْسَحُ بِيَدِي نَفْسِهِ sallallahu alayhi wasallam. She said that when the Prophet ﷺ got too sick to do it himself, she said, I started to take his hands and I would read Quran in his hands, and then I would blow on his hands, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and then I'd use his hands to wipe his face. Why? She said, لِبَرَكَتِهَا, because the blessing from the hands of the Prophet ﷺ is greater than my blessings. SubhanAllah, that's how detailed she's thinking. She said, let me read the Quran in his hands and then use his hands, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, to wipe his face and to help him. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha says that amongst the du'as that she narrates, she says that when the Prophet ﷺ was passing away, he had a cup of water and he put his hand in that cup of water and he would wipe himself, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he would say, Allahumma inni ala sakaratil maut, la ilaha illallah, inna lil mauti sakarat. Oh Allah, help me through the agony of death, La ilaha illallah inna lil mawti sakarat. And she said, I would hear the Prophet ﷺ saying, Allahumma ghfirli warhamni walhiqni bil rafiq al-a'la. Oh Allah, forgive me and have mercy on me, and let me join with the highest companion. And then she narrates the last visits. She says that when all of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ were gathered around him ﷺ in my house, because they would come to visit him in my house, she said, Ja'at Fatima. And you know, I know we've heard this narration, but the way Aisha even describes it is so beautiful. She says, Ja'at Fatimatu tamshi ka'anna mashyataha mashyatu Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Like even the way she was walking was like the walk of the Prophet ﷺ. Fatima was so like the Prophet ﷺ that she walks into the room and like you couldn't help but notice that even her walk was the same walk as the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ smiled and said, Marhaban bibnati marhaba. Welcome my beloved daughter, welcome my beloved daughter. فَأَجْلَسَهَا عَنْ يَمِينِهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. And the Prophet ﷺ sat her down on his right side. وَإِنَّهُ أَسَرَّ إِلَيْهَا حَدِيثًا فَبَكَتْ. That he said something in her ear and she started to cry. And then the Prophet ﷺ told her, come back. And he said something to her that caused her to laugh. So Aisha radiallahu anha said, I said to Fatima, what did he say to you? And Fatima said, this is a secret between me and my father. So she wouldn't tell Aisha radiallahu anha what happened until after the death. She'd say that the first time the Prophet ﷺ told me that I'm not going to survive this, that I'm going to die. And it made me cry. And the second time the Prophet ﷺ told me that you'll be the first one to follow me. So I started to laugh. Fatima radiallahu anha is a young woman, by the way, very young woman. But she was happy because the Prophet ﷺ just told her, you're about to die as well, to come and to be with me. And of course, the last thing the Sahaba saw of the Prophet ﷺ was the narration that Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu mentions of the Prophet ﷺ removing his curtain and looking at the companions praying. And the companions were so excited because they all thought that the Prophet ﷺ was going to heal and come out. And Rasulullah ﷺ was smiling and his face was as bright as the page of a mushaf. And the Prophet ﷺ ashara ilayhim, he signaled to them, keep praying, and he closed the curtain, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. At this point, the only person that's going to be with our Prophet ﷺ for the rest of his life here is Aisha radiallahu anha. Meaning, subhanAllah, of an ummah of over 100,000 at this point, only one person is going to spend whatever remains of his life with him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And that's Aisha radiallahu anha. So Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha says that the Prophet ﷺ was perched up against my chest, alayhi salatu wassalam. So they're sitting in the room and Aisha radiallahu anha says that the fever of the Prophet ﷺ was very hot and he was breathing hard, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And clearly he doesn't have much left, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And she says, Abdurrahman, my brother, came to check in on me and he had a siwak, a toothbrush. وَأَنَا مُسْنِدَةٌ Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And the Prophet ﷺ was leaning against me. فَرَأَيْتُهُ يَنْظُرُ إِلَيْهِ. So I noticed that the Prophet ﷺ, his eyes looked at the siwak. وَعَرَفْتُ أَنَّهُ يُحِبُّ السِّوَاكِ. And I knew the Prophet ﷺ used to love the siwak, especially before what? Before salah. Before he'd meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his salah, the Prophet ﷺ would always use the siwak. He liked to have beautiful breath, alayhi salatu wassalam, when he recited the Quran. فَقُلْتُ آخُذُهُ لَكَ. I said to the Prophet ﷺ, do you want me to take it? فَأَشَارَ بِرَأْسِهِ النَّعْمِ. The Prophet ﷺ simply nodded his head, meaning the Prophet ﷺ was so weak at this point that he couldn't even move his hand and he couldn't even respond with his voice, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So she said, I took it. فَتَنَاوَلْتُهُ فَاشْتَدَّ عَلَيْهِ وَقُلْتُ أُلَيِّنُهُ لَكَ فَأَشَارَ بِرَأْسِهِ النَّعْمِ فَلَيَّنْتُهُ. So she said, I took the siwak and it was stiff for him to use. So she said, should I soften it up for you? And the Prophet ﷺ nodded his head. So Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says that I took the siwak of the Prophet, the siwak, and I softened it with my own saliva, with my own mouth. And then I gave it to the Prophet ﷺ. I put it in his mouth and started to put the siwak around his mouth, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Then she says, min ni'am Allah, min ni'am Allahi alayya. One of the greatest blessings upon me, anna Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam tawaffiya fi bayti wa fi yawmi wa bayna sahri wa nahri wa anna Allah jama'a bayna riqi wa riqihi 'inda mawtihi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. She said that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would die in my house, and it happened to be my day, meaning even though the wives of the Prophet ﷺ had agreed that he could stay with her, that it happened to be her day anyway, in her home. And she said, between my chest and my thigh, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed the last thing the Prophet ﷺ to have in his mouth was my saliva mixed with his saliva. So she said, what a blessing that I had with the Prophet ﷺ. And Aisha radiallahu anha is the one that narrates the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, Man ahabba liqa'a Allah, ahabba Allah liqa'ah. Whoever loves to meet Allah, Allah loves to meet him. And whoever hates to meet Allah, Allah hates to meet him. And she said, I said to the Prophet ﷺ, Kulluna yakrahu al-mawt, Ya Rasulullah, we all hate death. And she said, La, innama dhaka 'inda mawtihi idha bushira bi rahmatillah wa maghfiratihi ahabba liqa'a Allah. He said to her, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that that's not what I'm talking about. This is referring to the last moments that the believer, when they are given their glad tidings of paradise at the time of death, at that moment they love to meet Allah. At that moment they love to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So she is now seeing that hadith come to fruition. And she says, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول وهو صحيح. The Prophet ﷺ used to say, when he was fully healthy, لن يقبض نبي قط حتى يرى مقعده من الجنة ثم يخير. Subhanallah. It's even more special for the prophets. You know, for the believers, you hope to see your kafan of Jannah, your cloth of Jannah. You hope to see the angels coming to you with pleasure. But the Prophet ﷺ said to her when he was healthy, alayhi salatu wassalam, no prophet passes away except that Allah shows them their place in Jannah and then gives them a choice. So before they leave this world, they already see their place in Jannah. So Rasulullah ﷺ, in those moments, he is seeing his place in Jannah, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And the masjid is waiting for news. The wives of the Prophet ﷺ are waiting for news. And Aisha is the only one with the Prophet ﷺ in these moments. And subhanAllah, there's a hikmah here, a wisdom, that Allah could have taken the Prophet ﷺ in sujood, in prostration, could have taken him leading the salah with the people. But Allah chose Aisha radiallahu anha's lap to hold the Prophet ﷺ for those last moments and for them to have those moments together. It shows you something, subhanAllah. And she said that when Jibreel alayhi salam entered into the room with the angel of death, and of course this is the greatest soul the angel of death has ever taken, right? The angel of death will never take a soul like taking the soul of the Prophet ﷺ. You could feel the presence of the malaika in that room. Like the Prophet ﷺ lights up. So she said, فَلَمَّا نَزَلَ بِهِ وَرَأْسُهُ عَلَى فَخِذِي غُشِيَ عَلَيْهِ سَاعَةً ثُمَّ أَفَاقَ. That while he was in my lap, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, at this point, he would lose consciousness and then he'd come back, make dua. He'd lose consciousness and then he'd come back. He'd make dua. And then when Jibreel alayhi salam entered the room with Malak al-Maut, with the angel of death, أَشْخَصَ بَصَرَهُ إِلَى السَّقْفِ. The Prophet ﷺ looked up and his eyes became fixated on the ceiling. And at that point, his face lit up, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And Aisha radiallahu anha says, قُلْتُ إِذًا لَا يَخْتَارُنَا. I said, in those moments, he's not going to choose us. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. SubhanAllah, like she's saying, I still had hope until the last moments that maybe he's going to cure, maybe he's going to heal. لكن قلت إذن لا يختارنا. In these moments, the way the Prophet ﷺ looked up and the way that the angels entered, I said, he's not going to choose us. And then he raised his finger to the sky and he said, Allahumma rafiq al-a'la, Allahumma rafiq al-a'la, Allahumma rafiq al-a'la. Oh Allah, the highest companion. Oh Allah, the highest companion. Oh Allah, the highest companion. And Aisha radiallahu anha said, those were the last words he said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and his soul left his body and his hand fell, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is the greatest tragedy that ever struck the earth, and it happened in her lap. Think about that for a moment. SubhanAllah, there is no tragedy in the history of this world that matches the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it happened in her lap. And you ask yourself, what would you do? The whole ummah, not one person except for her, radiallahu ta'ala anha, is holding the body of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and witnessing his last moments, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And she said when he passed away, she shrieked, radiallahu ta'ala anha. And when she shrieked, when she screamed, that's when everyone in the masjid knew what happened. Like they hadn't heard her scream like that before, radiallahu ta'ala anha. So that's when it overtakes the masjid, Mata Rasulullah, Mata Rasulullah, Mata Rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has passed away, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has passed away, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has passed away. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she admits in a narration, Muslim Imam Ahmad, she says that I stood up and I screamed. I mean, she didn't know how to handle the gravity of the moment. This is not the death of any human being, this is the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So she got up and she shouted. And then she narrates that Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu came. And she said that after I shouted, the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came, the women came, and they all started to cry over the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they covered the body of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam bi burdin hibara, with a cloak from Yemen. And his body was there, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she said that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu came bolting to the house. And she said that he passed through the masjid, and subhanallah, he didn't speak to anybody. Now when Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu enters into the masjid, he sees people screaming, he sees people shouting. He looks to the walls and he sees Ali and Uthman completely wiped out. Like they couldn't speak, they couldn't move. The greatest companions of the Prophet ﷺ are absolutely paralyzed in this moment. How do you come to terms with this? And he refused to talk to anyone until he got to the house of the Prophet ﷺ. So Aisha radiallahu anha says he entered into the house. فَكَشَفَ عَنْ وَجْهِهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. He removed that cloak. The Prophet ﷺ's body was laying there. He removed that cloak from the body of the Prophet ﷺ. And she says, أَكَبَّ عَلَيْهِ فَقَبَّلَهُ فَبَكَى. Abu Bakr threw himself on the body of the Prophet ﷺ. But Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu threw himself on the body of the Prophet ﷺ and kissed him and cried. And he said, بِأَبِي أَنْتَ وَاللَّهِ لَا يَجْمَعُ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكَ مَوْتَتَيْنِ أَبَدًا. He said, by Allah, Allah will never cause you to die twice. SubhanAllah. The death that was decreed for you, you've died. Ya Rasulullah, you're in good hands now. SubhanAllah. Al-Rafiq al-A'la. I think inshallah ta'ala we'll stop there. Hopefully reflect. Again, this was the greatest tragedy. The Prophet ﷺ said, when you lose someone that you love, اذكر مصابك في موت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Remember your tragedy in the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And Aisha radiallahu anha describing this moment, you have the last joke, the last smile, the last hug, the last conversation, the last dua, and here you have the last kiss from Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu to the forehead of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And profound words. Allah had a way of putting something on the tongue of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu that was unlike anyone else. لا يجمع الله عليك موتتين أبدا. How beautiful are you, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't let you die twice. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send His peace and blessings upon our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah be pleased with the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah be pleased with our mother Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, who had to witness that and who brought him so much joy and comfort until the very last moments of his life sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comfort us with the ru'ya of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam fi firdaus al-a'la, his eternal companionship. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let the death that He has decreed for all of us be a good death. Grant us all husn al-khitam. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let our eternity be in the companionship of our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for our shortcomings. Allahumma ameen. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll go ahead and we'll stop there and we'll continue next week. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.